Okay, let's get the meeting started. Thanks so much for making the time. I understand that some of you might actually have some questions with regard to this. So I thought I would meet you all very quickly. I do want us to try and work through this together as far as possible. I understand that there are some things to do for seminar 2 as well. We can also arrange a time after the first seminar to see when I can help you all with it. Similar to what I did for the students last year. Okay, so first of all, I think for us to be able to understand what this history seminar is about is to understand that what we are going to, or what you are going to be talking about with Prof. Lockhart and the other participants is this idea of historiography. Historiography is, if I can define it as simply as possible, the study of the methods of studying history or the methods of doing history. So what you see here with regard to the Manslow quote, if you find it difficult to understand, please don't think that you are stupid or anything like that, because it's really not the case. University students struggle with this. I struggled with this when I was in university. And so you see from the quote here, the genuine nature of history can be understood only when it is viewed not solely and simply as an objectivized empiricist enterprise, but as a creation and eventual imposition by historians of a particular narrative form on the past, right? I think for most people, you lose us after viewed, right? And then thereafter is this like full amalgamation of words. So what I want us to do, right, is this set of slides here. You probably won't show it in the presentation, but from here onwards, maybe what we can do after this is just include 2 slides. The first slide, it says why we might agree with this quote, why we might disagree with the quote. Anyway, it's just a short 3-minute presentation, so don't put too much pressure on yourselves to have an extensive presentation and so-called get the right answer. Okay, let's go to this. I don't know what devices you are using, whether you are using your laptop, whether you're using what do you call it? Your handphones. But I wonder whether you are able to log into this set of slides, or at very most just unmute and let me know what are some of the keywords you think we need to analyze when we look at this code, or what are some words you might have questions about. Maybe you just unmute and then I'll type it out. Maybe it's easier that way.
Objectivized, empiricist, enterprise.
Yeah, objectivized. Okay, let's keep it as one whole phrase. Okay, empiricist. Okay, let me just address Johan. Hi, Johan. Thanks for joining us. You can keep your camera off. It's okay. I'm recording the conversation. But we're just going through some of the keywords in the question now. Anything else?
Particular narrative form on the past.
Particular narrative form. Anything else? How about eventual imposition by historians? Okay, let's deal with this 3 things first, okay? Just do a quick Google or something like that. Either Google the word objective, empiricist, and then what do you think this phrase means? So let's try and work through this together. So with the paraphrase this, what might this mean? Anybody who finds something, just shut up.
I'm guessing that it's someone that supports what they believe in, thinking that it's like the most objective answer.
Okay, so let's deal with the word objective, right? And the conventional understanding of objectivity means that it is free from bias, right? So it will be things like free from bias. What's empiricist?
Based on past experiences. Like
Based on past experiences.
on evidence.
Yeah, based on facts actually, right? Empirical evidence, right? Based on facts and evidence, very good. Right? So what we have here essentially is that they don't, like people like Manslow do not believe that history can be this. All right. So I just put an X here. They don't believe that history can be something that, in some sense, is free enough from bias. History can never be free from bias, right? But people like Munslow don't believe that history can ever be free enough of bias for it to be about the facts and the evidence. Okay, which then brings us to this. I think it's easier to deal with. If they don't think that history can be free from bias, this part I'll give to you all for free, okay? So therefore, what they are saying is that is an eventual imposition by historians, right? So history is necessarily shaped by the perspective of the historian. And in some sense, it is okay if you think that the historian is able to use the evidence in a way whereby the past is still so-called reconstructed. And I'm going to use this word very intentionally because later on you'll see the difference between a reconstructionist and a deconstructionist, right? So if you believe history can be reconstructed by the evidence, even though you inject some of your own bias and perspective, more or less you're able to approximate what really happened, okay? Munslow, however, disagrees in that regard, right? And so when he says that it's an imposition of a particular narrative form on the past, what do you think this means? Where's Vivian? Vivian, you take literature, right?
Yes.
Okay, so literature is a fact or fiction.
Fiction.
Fiction in some sense, okay, but in literature, what do we have? Have you all learned about tropes?
Not really.
Okay, so sometimes in literature, let's say in Hamlet, right? Hamlet is a tragedy. Are you doing Hamlet now?
Yes.
Okay, spoiler alert, a lot of people die. Okay, now thanks, Vivian, you can read yourself already. So in Hamlet, for example, it's a tragedy, right? Because the playwright intends to write it as a tragedy. So there's this group of historians, I wouldn't even call them historians, I'm sorry, there's this group of thinkers who are called postmodernists. And postmodernists include people like Hayden White, Michel Foucault, and Munslow falls somewhere in that category also. Hayden White especially was quite famous for likening history to literature. And so what he says in that history, there are different tropes. It can be a tragedy, it can be a comedy, it can be, you want to talk about, triumph or whatever it is, but the historian first decides in some sense what narrative they want, and they shape the evidence according to it, right? So what this means over here, when you talk about a particular narrative form on the past, right, is that, for lack of a better word, therefore history is subject to how the historian wishes to speak about or interpret the past. So this, if you see, going from here to here, there is a gap. The gap is that if you think history is a bit more like literature, then history necessarily is primarily about interpretation. And when you have a set of facts, it really gives a lot of autonomy to the historian to shape it, right? So that's deconstructionist. I can deconstruct history and I can piece it together in a way that best makes sense to me. Reconstructionists say, yes, historians have a certain liberty and autonomy to work with, but you don't have as much autonomy as the deconstructionists suggest, because you're still bound in some sense by what the evidence is telling you. Okay, I'm going to pause here right now. Do you all have any questions? I'm going to just give it a good minute or so and really not say anything. I'm going to give us time to type it in the chat or to ask me verbally if you have any questions. I'll just give it 30 more seconds, okay? Okay, so no one has asked a question. Fundamentally, your task for part 1 of the history seminar is to decide your own stand with regard to this particular quote. So if we understand this particular quote, what you need to understand is Mansell is putting forth a perspective about history. He's saying that when historians uncover the past, so to speak, in fact, he doesn't even think the past can be uncovered. When the historians interpret the past, the role of the historian, in some sense, trumps that of what evidence is there. The historian really has a lot of agency and autonomy to decide what story they want to tell. Okay, which again, Reconstructionists will disagree with. So you have to decide as a group where you sit on that. In some sense, you don't have to come to a definite stand. My suggestion, as I said, is one slide why we might agree with this quote. And therefore, when you agree with this quote, you'll be leaning more towards a deconstructionist side of things. You are seeing history as more as interpretation. You are going to be someone who says, well, bias really is quite prevalent. We cannot read any historical account of it. All right, and therefore, it really is primarily about interpretation. If you disagree with the quote, you're going to lean more to the reconstructionist side of things, where you're going to say, yes, I agree that historians have agency, autonomy, they can interpret. At the same time, it is not as though they have free reign with the evidence to the point where what they say is not in some way shaped by the facts and the evidence that's there. Okay, all right. So at any point in time, please unmute yourself and ask me a question. This is very heavy going stuff. Yeah. Okay. So I put together some things for us. I hope it's useful. I won't read verbatim. Okay. But basically, what we need to know is there are at least three kinds of historians, so to speak, or three genres as is being pointed out here. All right, Reconstructionists, constructionists, and deconstructionists. For the purposes of your seminar, I don't think you really have to split hairs over what is a Reconstructionist versus a constructionist. If you ask me, I also don't really know, frankly, the difference between them. But what you need to know is Reconstructionists and constructionists can generally be grouped together, and they believe in the disinterested pursuit of knowledge regarding the past. A fun fact about grammar, disinterest is different from uninterested, I think. Or is it the other way around? Actually, I think the proper term here might be uninterested. It just means neutral. It means that you're able to detach yourself, right, in interpreting the past. So what they believe is that the facts are there. The historian comes in to interpret. The historian is able to interpret and piece together in the facts where they're able to step back and say the historian doesn't really have to show up in the eventual story. Okay? Deconstructionists, on the other hand, says, no. History, when people put it together, historians will naturally have their own bias. They will think about evidence they want to use. They will want to shape history in a particular way. And in some sense, the story that is eventually told is not really historical in a sense, but it is a historical narrative that the historian chooses to talk about, right? So it's very difficult for the deconstructionists to say that the historian and the eventual historical story that's told are separate, right? They are so overlapping that you are reading what the historian wants you to understand about the past, all right? So that's the difference between a reconstructionist and deconstructionist. In summary, it goes back to the same things we talked about just now. Reconstructionists and constructionists believe there can be some objectivity, some distance between themselves and the past. Deconstructionists say there is no such thing. A historian will impose, a historian will interpret, a historian will shape history according to what they believe is the best kind of history. Okay? Ken, ask me if you have any questions. And I'll go on to the next slide first. Okay. So there are some key figures in historiography. One is a Greek historian, Herodotus. He's known as the father of history. Herodotus actually did believe that there is some element of bias in whatever accounts are told, right? But at the same time, he also believes that you are able to use archival evidence to document, to talk about the things that went on in the past, right? So it's not just about interpretation per se, but the facts and the evidence do tell you some things, right? So I just record, and from the records, you can discern what history was like, okay? Leopold von Ranke is a German historian, and he is someone who believes that you can, as you see here, the role of the historian is to show what actually happened. I'm going to oversimplify it to make a point. Leopold von Ranke basically believed that history can be discovered as it was. The facts will speak for themselves. The role of the historian is to gather the facts, put them together, and the story will be told. Again, I'm oversimplifying. But what von Ranke therefore really believes is very far from what the deconstructionists believe. Because the deconstructionists believe it's about primarily interpretation. Von Ranke believes it's empirical in nature. The evidence will tell you the story. You don't have to mess around too much. You just need to go there, put it together, and the story will be told. Okay, so that's von Ranke. Then you have E.H. Carr, whose reading you have to consider for your second seminar. I'm going to pause here. I'm going to let you read this for 30 seconds, just so you can take a break from my voice and you can read this for yourself. Okay, I might be misunderstanding and misrepresenting Carr, but I'll do my best. Essentially, Carr doesn't, as you can see, doesn't believe in what von Ranke believed, which was that history can really just be to show how it really was, right? So it is not as objective as empiricist as someone like von Ranke might believe. But if I remember and I understand correctly, Carr also doesn't swing all the way until the deconstructionists. But he does recognize necessarily that there is subjectivity in history, right? And I think this is one of the things that we do in our H2 also. Can someone be biased and be telling so-called the truth? My own stand is yes, that your own bias need not necessarily shape the narrative in a way whereby it just becomes your story in that sense, right? But what Carr perhaps is hinting at is that when you recognize your own bias, and you recognize that it's always going to be a degree of subjectivity in history, then what we will arrive at is this notion that history can still be arrived at, but it is neither entirely objective, nor is it entirely subjective. Okay, so in some sense, once we know what our bias is, then we can piece together the jigsaw puzzle of the past, so to speak. Okay, last ones. Like I said, you saw Keith Jenkins, Hayden White, Michel Foucault, Alan Manslow. These are names that fall into this postmodernist thinking, right? Manslow basically believes that the role of the historian, as I put here, actually supersedes the narrative. This is my own paraphrasing. If you don't find it to be accurate, I apologize. You can go look at some resources online also. But basically, for me, it's the notion that a historian, right, the role that they play will somewhat surpass that of the objective truth. Right? So evidence is there to be shaped, to be molded by the historian. Whereas I think reconstructionists say, yes, I agree that there's some subjectivity, but some pieces of evidence are not meant to be molded, neither can they be molded, right? You do have to work with what the evidence presents to you, okay? So according to Alan Manslow, the evidence is turned into facts through the narrative interpretation of historians. Okay, so in his account, Deconstructing History, which is what you're reading as the article, whatever we decide, it follows that history cannot exist for the reader until the historian writes it in its obligatory form, which is narrative. So history for him is akin to narrative. Like I said, with people like Hayden White, it's a story. It is a literary piece. You kind of decide how you want to shape it. What do you want to tell the reader? What is it about the past that you want them to believe in? And then you shape your narrative accordingly. Okay, which therefore brings us back to this quote. It is essentially a disagreement with a reconstructionist view and a leaning towards the deconstructionist view. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly add in 2 slides for you all here. You can actually use these slides. The reason why I parked this after the thank you slides, right, is just so that you can use this and you can hide the rest of the slides, okay? So why we might. And I thought since we are here, why not we get started a bit? You can just draw your ideas as a rough skeletal form. I'll have you type it in. Yeah, so you give me a moment. Let me change the font because it's hard to read. So while I'm doing this, right, maybe you all just quickly think. I'm going to ask for your responses in just a little while. Why do you think that you might agree with it? Why do you think you might disagree with it? Okay, anybody? Come, let's do this quickly and then you all can enjoy your afternoon. So what are some reasons we might actually agree that with what Manslow says over here? Okay, essentially, why might we agree that history is mainly about interpretation, that you cannot objectively recover the past?
Maybe because history is like written by the winners. So there's like, even when you have objective evidence, that objective evidence itself might be like subjective to the like who is like recording the evidence at that time.
Okay, that's a great start. Anyone else? Let's try and find maybe 3 points per slide.
I think I agree because like there are a lot of cases where people can choose certain evidence that fits their narrative and like ignore other pieces of evidence that go against it, and just the way that they shape it and the way that they pick certain evidence can like fit their own agenda a lot of the time.
Please tell me if I'm misrepresenting what you are saying, okay? It's great stuff. One more?
I think it's like intrinsic in humans to have like cognitive biases, and it might translate into their writing.
Sure.
Yeah.
People have biases, right? Have biases, cognitive or otherwise, and these would in turn influence how they choose to write about history. And have I accurately interpreted what you are saying?
I have another point.
Sorry?
I have another point.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thinking how like a lot of times history can be written by like a different group of people who doesn't see the same value in a certain event, like when the Western civilization would go over and they would view history of a different nation, and it's completely off because they have different value for certain things.
Yeah. Is that okay, Maya? Yeah, I don't have time to go into this, but that's an excellent point. In fact, what happens later on is there's a movement called Histories from Below, precisely because, for example, in India, there was an incident whereby Indians rioted against the police station. And what happened was, written from a colonial perspective would say that this confirms how Indian people were unruly and they needed to be subject to British colonization because they couldn't manage themselves. But the history from below would say that actually it's about, if I remember correctly, it's about mistreatment. It's about the people facing a certain set of conditions that were unfavorable, and they decided to finally rise up. Right. So I think what Maya has just pointed out is precisely that, and that's excellent. Okay, 4 excellent points. We can do this. I am very hopeful. We will end this meeting early. Why might we disagree with Alan Manslow? So start to think about why we may agree that history is interpreted and there's an element of bias, all these things over here, but why we might not be comfortable going to the extent to say that, well, history really is just about interpretation. It's about what story you want to tell. Okay, I'll give you an extreme example just to get you thinking about things, okay? If history truly was purely interpretation, okay, so I'm using an extreme, then in some sense, when I look at a particular event like the Holocaust, Maya's interpretation is hers, Vivian's is hers, Johan's is his, Angeline's is hers, right? And Zoe's is hers, and mine is mine. Okay? Let's say all 4 or 5 of you agree that the Holocaust really happened. But I say that it has never happened before. Okay? And then you all take out evidence, pictures of Auschwitz, pictures of other concentration camps, records of the Nazis, Hitler's quotes, Goebbels' propaganda, whatever it is, and you show it to me. I say, no. But at the end of the day, right, this is just a fabrication. Let me show you other Nazis who denied that this ever happened. I'm going to use that as my evidence instead. Okay? And this actually really happened in some sense, because some German historians actually denied the Holocaust actually happened. If history really is just about interpretation, then any truth, as long as a person holds to it, in some ways becomes a valid truth. I will personally tell you that I fundamentally disagree with this, right? But I want to hear from you all why someone might disagree that history is primarily interpretation, that the historian imposes upon the evidence and says, I want to shape it in this way, this is how it's going to be shaped. Yeah. What are some issues you might see with that?
You could say that because if there's a quote like the present is the sum of all past experiences up to now. So if history is subjective in nature, okay, history can't be subjective in nature because there have been objective events that happen that made the present what it is now. So yeah, I mean, you can't.
Yes. I think I get it. Yep. You're gonna continue. Don't let me interrupt you. You can't.
That's all I had to say. Like.
Okay. So you see where I type and see whether it's correct. Okay. History may not be fully subjective in nature because one can point to objective pieces of evidence that inform us about how the past was, even if these pieces of evidence may be subsequently interpreted in a subjective manner. So I'm adding a bit of stuff, but Johan, if I understand you correctly, and that's a really good point. Your quote about, the present is kind of like the sum of things that happened in the past, that it is possible to look at what happened today and to objectively trace it back to certain things that happened in the past. So for example, this is a very loose parallel and analogy, okay? So forgive me if it's not very good. So for example, if you go to, and you see Sir Stamford Raffles statue, the fact that it's there today tells us that at some point in time the British colonized us. And that happened in the past. And that is an objective piece of evidence. What we may think about Raffles' role in the colonization, whether he was the one who was a star, who really shaped Singapore to be what it is, whether Singapore was a sleepy fishing village before that, that's a matter of subjective interpretation. But objectively, the evidence tells us that he really was here. Okay, so I think that's how I would phrase it. Johan, is this okay with you?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, no problem. This one's maybe a bit tougher. Maybe just at least two more. Whatever comes to mind, just go ahead and then I'll try to shape it together with you all. Okay, so think back, all right? Let me help you out a bit. Think back to whatever we've been doing for history thus far, all right? When we learn about things like the Cold War, there are debates, for example, as to who started the Cold War, who started the Korean War, who started the Vietnam War, okay? Is it a case whereby, for example, I am an American, all right? And I look at American atrocities in the Vietnam War, for example. Subjectively, I have certain experiences that may make me more loyal to America, which is what y'all will usually recognize, right? But we have also dealt with sources where you'll say that, oh, well, while this may be true, this American official rightly notes that America pursued, let's say, a disastrous campaign in Vietnam, or even earlier ones where when we're talking about Truman, thinking that the Soviets are bent on taking over the world, expansionists. There are also sources we have been through where the American officials at that time working in Truman's administration they say, hold on, there is at least some legitimacy to what the Soviets are saying. Okay, so to shape this second point, just think about this, right? And someone phrase this for me, answer this question. Is it possible for a subjective individual to give a relatively objective interpretation of the past? Is it possible? And if so, why? If not, why not?
Wait, sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah. Is it possible for a subjective individual to give a relatively objective interpretation of the past? In the same way that the American official can say, I may not like the Soviets, but legitimately they have security concerns because they're invaded by Germany and they need a buffer in Eastern Europe.
I think
Then,
sorry, you
Go ahead.
it's fine. You go ahead. I spoke just now.
I think yes, because if the person giving the opinion is able to acknowledge like their own subjectivity and like is able to go beyond knowing that they like to look past how they have biases and try to be objective, they can reach a more objective conclusion.
Yep.
Zeitgeist?
Zeitgeist is it is like the prevailing thinking of that time. Yeah. So postmodern movement, for example, can be the zeitgeist of that time, or if you the way you look at the world, right? But it doesn't have to be there, okay? I'm just putting it there for your consideration. And from there, acknowledge how subjectivity may have some influence on their interpretation of history while piecing together history in a less subjective manner because of their because it's American English. Okay, I'll give you the American English. No, because it's sure. Okay. Maya, if I understand you correctly, is that when we recognize, like what is it, the historian kind of knows about their bias, they know there's a certain element of subjectivity. So the times that they're writing in, they look at it and say, okay, why am I thinking about the past in this way? And as they're writing it, as they're conscious of it, is to take a step back each time and to say, okay, I must be careful not to insert myself into this story. And where I do, I will qualify and I will say, I am interpreting it in this way, possibly because of my own experiences. Is that a suitable summary?
Yeah.
That's not very convinced. That's what some historians actually say. That in some ways, it's almost like we don't draw this kind of firm line between subjectivity and objectivity, right? No history is ever 100% objective, but at the same time, maybe it's also not 100% subjective. Yeah, and so what we need, I think like what Maya was probably implying, and I hope I got it correct, is that it's about having that awareness that there might be that subjectivity, and then what do you do with it?
I feel like it doesn't really disagree with the quote though, because it's acknowledging that there is a, like, you aren't seeing it objectively, like you know that you're not, but
Yep.
and by justifying it in your writing doesn't that mean you technically agree with it.
I think it's an excellent point. So this one, I think we can all take note together since we are here. The difference from this is that it's almost like the historian cannot really identify how their bias might influence the narrative. Whereas this one is a bit more like the historian can identify where their subjectivity may actually influence the narrative, and they're able to take a step back and say, okay, number one, either they're able to say, okay, I'm not going to let this seep into and influence how I interpret the past, or they're able to say, okay, where this is something that necessarily is so entangled that I cannot separate myself from the narrative, I'm going to let my readers know about it. Yeah, you may want to focus a bit more on the fact that if they recognize their own subjectivity, they can actually do so in a less subjective manner. So in some ways, it's almost like when I am aware that I can potentially have some biases, then it makes me write history in a more objective manner, for lack of a better word. Okay. I'm going to give you an example. Okay. So I'm a Christian. All right. And my master's thesis was on the interpretations of Christianity. And so what I needed to do was to look at evidence that talked about how people agree with what the Bible says about the Christian story, and how other narratives came in and said that this story isn't the only story, there are multiple other ways to interpret it. Okay. Of course, I am biased, and of course, I will slant towards the idea that the Christian narrative is the biblical one, which is what's in the Bible. Okay, but that doesn't prevent me from acknowledging any valid points made by those who propose alternative Christianities. Right. So, in summary, because I'm aware of my own biases and my own inclinations, I am extra careful not to dismiss what the other side is saying. Yeah, and even though the history that is eventually written is not 100% objective, neither is it as subjective as what the deconstructionists would say. Does that make a bit more sense, Maya?
A bit.
A bit. Okay, it's a tough thing. It's a tough thing to wrap our heads around, right? Think about subjectivity and objectivity as existing on a spectrum. If you swing 100% to subjectivity, it becomes entirely narrative. You swing 100% to objectivity, you swing to Leopold von Ranke, history equals to facts, right? But where many historians sit, the reconstructionists sit somewhere in between. I recognize that there's an element of subjectivity, but that subjectivity is not sufficient to interfere with me being able to give a very close approximation of what really happened in the past. Yeah, so we might disagree with the quote because we don't think subjectivity of the historian makes it 100% narrative. Okay, just put this here for you to consider as a comment. Rephrase, perhaps to reflect. Okay, let you figure it out. Okay, I tell you what, this is very heavy stuff. We've got 2 points here. I don't know whether you have any questions. I think we can leave this here for now. And then we can have these points. The point of the presentation is not to get the answers right. The point of the presentation on is it the 12th? Right, is really to be confident enough to understand these things so that you can present it in a way that shows you understand. Do you have any questions for me? Okay, thank you very much for taking the time. I'm just going to summarize very quickly for us, right? This is a deconstructionist point of view, as evident by the book title. Okay, all right. Therefore, history is primarily interpretation and narrative. The historian decides what story they want to tell, and history is pieced together accordingly. So why we might agree with the quote is all these things. This seems a bit more difficult for us to think about right now, but I really want us to think about things like, for example, when we are given certain pieces of evidence, it might not be as malleable, as easy to manipulate as some deconstructionists may imply. That might be another thing that you want to go to. I'll just leave one last thing here for you, right? Is to consider also whether evidence is as valuable as the deconstructionists imply. Okay, so on Friday, just go enjoy yourself and give your best. I know previous batches, it's always my students will come back and tell me they feel intimidated by students from other schools whom I shall not name. But I want you all to know that we selected you all because we really believe you can hold your own. If anything, then just take it as a learning experience. Okay. All right. So I won't keep you all anymore. Thank you so much for making the time. I will send you all the Zoom link via the chat. Okay. Thank you. Take care and happy National Day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
No
you.
problem.
Thank you.
No problem. Bye-bye.
Mr. Chen, can I ask a question?
Yes. Where are you, Zoe?
Yeah. I was
Hello.
gonna
Yeah.
ask, like, can someone say that subjectivity and objectivity cannot be mutually exclusive?
Try and explain that to me. You don't mind? I'm still recording this. I think it's a good question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Whether it's wrong to say, like I was Googling it when we were discussing, and they say that like subjectivity is the opposite of objectivity.
Uh-huh.
I was just wondering whether they can coexist, like,
Yeah.
because that's what we were discussing,
Yeah.
right? But then is it
Yeah.
wrong for me to say that subjectivity and objectivity cannot be mutually exclusive?
Which
Oh,
means they can coexist, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that is an excellent way to put it. Okay, so in my very noob understanding, right, deconstructionists will say that they really cannot coexist because history is necessarily subjective.
Mhm.
Leopold von Ranke would say that history is necessarily objective. But what I think the reconstructionists are saying is that when you can recognize your own bias and how it shapes history, that you can make it less subjective than it needs, it may become, even if you cannot achieve the so-called 100% objective truth.
Right.
Yeah. And one thing to understand about history and what historians do, actually, we are looking at plausibility, not certainty. So
Mhm.
for example, right, when I look at who might have started the Cold War, I'm not trying to arrive at an interpretation where done and dusted, confirm there's only this interpretation.
Okay.
What I'm trying to look at is, in all the possible interpretations, which are the most plausible ones based on the evidence and why.
Mm.
And so by acknowledging that history is fundamentally about plausibility, it removes the onerous burden of saying that it must be 100% objective, because that's something that can never be achieved,
Mhm.
right? So your stand should be the correct one, which is that actually, logically speaking, subjectivity and objectivity can coexist.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's why I banned the word bias, because the word bias is being abused. I know Lockhart is probably going to address it. I saw it in one of the questions. But the reason why I say it cannot be used is because people throw bias around as though there can be somebody who is, like what you say, 100% objective.
Mhm.
But it's not about that. It's
Right,
am I less objective or more subjective than the other person, and why?
Okay.
And therefore they can coexist.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a good question. Why not ask just now?
They're kind of scary.
It's on the recording, by the way.
I mean, they sound really smart.
You're really smart as well. We shall talk about this more.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, but I was just like, I couldn't phrase the question right. So I was
Yeah.
like,
No, I think that's a great question. Essentially, your question is whether or not subjectivity and objectivity can coexist. And the answer is yes, and they should be seen in that way, as
Okay.
opposed to being seen as two things. You either choose objectivity or you choose objectivity.
right. Okay.
Can?
Then for the seminar, do we need to arrive? Like, do we have to stay a stand or something? Like,
No, I don't think so. I think what they're really trying to get you all to do is to really look at how history is being debated in this way.
okay.
Yep.
Okay. Ken,
Can.
thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.